Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, students, this is the fifth lecture of our class, Literary Forms and Movements. Students, in our previous classes, we have discussed the definition of literature as the reflection of life and as a defined language, and then we relate that thing with the literary forms and movements. Students, with these lectures, we must understand that the literature is the imaginary writings of author. So in today's lecture, we are going to discuss this idealism that literature is based upon. So the course outline of today's lecture: first we would discuss the introduction of idealism and subjective idealism, how it is different from objective idealism, and then the Greek concepts about the idealism in this regard, metaphysical idealism and Platonic idealism, and the subjective idealists of Greek times, and then classical idealism, the pre-Socratic philosophy, Platonism and New Platonism. Students, idealism in philosophy is a diverse group of metaphysical views which all assert that reality is in some way indistinguishable or imparable or inseparable from human perception or understanding, that it is in some sense mentally constructed, or that it is otherwise closely connected to ideas. Students, in contemporary scholarship, traditional idealist views are generally divided into two groups: subjective idealism and objective idealism. Subjective idealism takes as its starting point that objects only exist to the extent that they are perceived by someone, whereas the objective idealism posits the existence of an objective consciousness which exists before and in some sense independently of human consciousness. Students, thereby bringing about the existence of objects independently of human minds. In the early modern period, George Berkeley was often considered the paradigmatic idealist, as he asserted that the essence of objects is to be perceived. By contrast, Immanuel Kant, a pioneer of modern idealist thought, held that his version of idealism does not concern the existence of things, but asserts only that our modes of representation of them, above all space and time, are not determinations that belong to things in themselves, but essential features of our own minds. Students, Kant called this position transcendental idealism, or sometimes critical idealism, holding the objects of experience relied for their existence on the mind, and that the way that things in themselves are outside of our experience cannot be thought without applying the categories which structure all of our experience. However, since Kant's view affirms the existence of some things independently of experience, namely things in themselves, it is very different from the more traditional idealism of Berkeley. So students, epistemologically, idealism is accompanied by skepticism about the possibility of knowing any mind-independent thing. In its ontological commitments, idealism goes further, asserting that all entities rely on the mind for their existence. Ontological idealism thus rejects both physicalist and dualist views as failing to ascribe ontological priority to the mind. Students, in contrast to materialism, idealism asserts the primacy of consciousness as the origin and prerequisite of phenomena. Idealism, students, in this regard, holds consciousness or mind to be the origin of the material world, in the sense that it is a necessary condition for our positioning of a material world, and it aims to explain the existing world according to these principles. Students, after this explanation, you must keep in your mind that the writers, other literary scholars, they idealize their surrounding world and then put that idealism on the text. So in this regard, we must discuss the origin of the concept of idealism. Students, idealism is a term with several related meanings. It comes via Latin idea from the ancient Greek idea, from idea meaning to see. The term entered the English language by 1743. It was first used in the abstract metaphysical sense, belief that reality is made up only of ideas, by Christian Wolff in 1747. Students, the term re-emerged in the English language in this abstract sense by 1796 in auditory language, as when speaking of Woodrow Wilson's political idealism. It generally suggests the priority of ideas, principal values and goals over concrete realities. Idealists are understood to represent the world as it might or should be, unlike pragmatics, who focus on the world as it presently is. In the arts, students, similarly, idealism affirms imagination and attempts to realize a mental conception of beauty, a standard of perfection juxtaposed to aesthetic naturalism and realism. The term idealism is also sometimes used in a sociological sense, which emphasizes how human ideas, especially beliefs and values, shape society. Students, any philosophy that assigns crucial importance to the idea, to the ideal or spiritual domain in its account of human existence may be termed as idealist. Metaphysical idealism is an ontological doctrine that holds that reality itself is incorporeal or experiential, experiential as at its core. Beyond this, idealists disagree on which aspects of the mental are more basic. Platonic idealism affirms that abstraction are more basic to reality than the things we perceive, while subjective idealists and phenomenalists tend to privilege sensory experience over abstract reasoning. Whereas students, epistemological idealism is the view that reality can only be known through ideas, that only psychological experience can be apprehended by the mind. So students, these are some of the thoughts on idealisms. In this regard, subjective idealists like George Berkeley are anti. However, subjective idealists like George Berkeley are anti-realists in terms of a mind-independent world, whereas transcendental idealists like Kant are strong skeptics of such a world, affirming epistemological and not metaphysical idealism. Thus, Kant defines idealism as the assertion that we can never be certain whether all of our accepted outer experience is not mere imagining. He claimed that, according to idealism, the reality of external objects does not admit of strict proof. On the contrary, however, the reality of the object of our internal sense of myself and state is clear immediately through consciousness. However, not all idealists restrict the real or the knowable to our immediate subjective experience. Objective idealists make claims about a trans-empirical world but simply deny that this world is essentially divorced from or ontologically prior to the mental. Thus, Plato affirms an objective and knowable reality transcending our subjective awareness, a rejection of epistemological idealism, but purposes that this reality is grounded in ideal entities, a form of metaphysical idealism. Nor do all metaphysical idealists agree on the nature of the ideal. For Plato, the fundamental entities were non-mental abstract forms. As a rule, transcendental idealists like Kant affirm idealism's epistemic side without committing themselves to whether reality is ultimately mental. Objective idealists like Plato affirm reality's metaphysical basis in the mental or abstract without restricting their epistemology to ordinary experience. And subjective idealists like Berkeley affirm both metaphysical and epistemological idealism. Students, idealism as a form of metaphysical monism holds that consciousness not matter, is the ground of all being. It is monist because it holds that there is only one type of thing in the universe, and idealist because it holds that one thing to be consciousness. Students, Anaxagoras taught that all things were created by nous, that is mind. He held that mind held cosmos together and gave human beings a connection to the cosmos or a pathway to the divine. However, Plato's theory of forms or ideas describes ideal form. For example, the Platonic solids in geometry or abstracts like goodness and justice as universals existing independently of any particular instance. Some scholars call this doctrine the classic example of a metaphysical idealism as a transcendent idealism, while Simon Klein calls Plato the earliest representative of metaphysical objective idealism. Nevertheless, Plato holds that matter is real, though transitory and imperfect, and is perceived by our body and its senses and given existence by the eternal ideas that are perceived directly by our rational soul. Plato was therefore a metaphysical and epistemological dualist, an outlook that modern idealism has striven to avoid. Students, Plato's thought cannot therefore be counted as idealist in the modern sense. Students, with the Neoplatonist Plotinus wrote Alfred Boole, there even appears, probably for the first time in Western philosophy, idealism that had long been current in the East. Even at that time, for it taught that the soul has made the world by stepping from eternity into time. Similarly, in regard to passages from the only space or place of the world is the soul, and time must not be assumed to exist outside the soul. Ludwig wrote, for the first time in Western philosophy, we find idealism proper in Plotinus. However, Plotinus does not address whether we know external objects, unlike the thinking of different scholars and modern scholars and philosophers. Students, in today's lecture you must keep in your mind one thing, that the poets and prose writers and novelists, they perceive the surrounding words through their mind. It is their reality. And when we read that text, so we are reading them in a different reality.